everyone. We're very lucky to have as our first keynote for our conference Dr. Mona Simion, who's from University of Glasgow. She's part of the Keynote research group, and she works on all kinds of things, mainly like epistemic norms and normativity, or norms without normativity, or all these things, and also feminist epistemology. She's got a forthcoming book, Epistemic Norms and Functions. And she's going to be giving a talk on some of her feminist philosophy work, and this is called Hermeneutical Injustice as Facing Failure. So let's welcome her.
Thanks a lot for having me and for picking up this awesome event. I'm going to talk about hermeneutical injustice, but I want to start by discussing a case of geographic injustice. It's much colder in Edinburgh, and everybody kept telling me that Glasgow is horrible, that I'm going to, die there of pneumonia, but it's always colder in Edinburgh. I want to point that out if there are any tourists in the room. Glasgow is the actual Hawaii of Scotland. So this is this talk is going to be concerned with a bit of Miranda Fricker's book that's less well discussed usually. So, people care a lot about testimonial injustice. I discussed a case like that in my response earlier. Not so many people have been discussing hermeneutical injustice, and I think that that's a shame, because I think that we need to do systematic work in order to figure out more systematic work in order to figure out what is happening in cases of hermeneutical injustice. So, very roughly, for those of you who are not very familiar with the phenomenon, epistemic injustice, broadly speaking, is supposed to be, according to Miranda Fricker, a case where you harm someone in their capacity as a knower, and Miranda identifies two main cases of such injustice. The first is testimonial injustice, where what you do is what George, in my example earlier, did. You assign less credibility than deserved to a testifier, maybe in virtue of their race or their gender. So that's not what I'm going to be focusing on today. Hermeneutical injustice is a more complex phenomenon. So what's happening in this case is, again, very roughly, according to Miranda, is that the resources, the conceptual resources that are available to a community render a person's experiences unintelligible to that particular person, right? So because that person is part of a marginalized group, the social milieu that she inhabits just doesn't put together the necessary conceptual resources that she basically needs in order to understand what's happening to her, to interpret her own experiences. And that's because she is part of this kind of marginalized group. So I'm gonna expand a bit on that in the beginning of the talk. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna first argue that Fricker's account is too restrictive, that hermeneutical injustice is actually much more ubiquitous than she takes it to be. I'm going to propose a novel view of the nature of hermeneutical injustice, and against Fricker, I'm going to argue that hermeneutical injustice is not this special epistemic phenomenon that she thought it was. It's actually garden variety distributive injustice. So first, I'm going to tell you a bit about Fricker, then I'm going to tell you about some problems that she's got, and then I'm going to propose my view. So here's the case that Fricker puts forth in order to illustrate how hermeneutical injustice works. The case is called sexual harassment. I'm just going to read it out. Carmita Wood had worked for 8 years in Cornell's Department of Nuclear Physics, advancing from lab assistant to a desk job handling administrative course. Wood did not know why she had been singled out, but the distinguished professor seemed unable to keep his hands off her. The eminent man would jiggle his crotch when he stood near her desk and looked at his mail, or he'd deliberately brush against her breasts while reaching for some papers. One day he cornered her in the elevator and implanted some unwanted kisses on her mouth. After this incident, Wood went out of her way to use the stairs in the lab building in order to avoid the repeat encounter, but the stress of the fortified molestations and her efforts to keep the scientist at a distance brought on a host of physical symptoms. Wood developed chronic back and neck pains, her right thumb tingled and grew numb. She requested a transfer to another department, and when it didn't come through, she quit and applied for unemployment insurance. When the claims investigator asked why she had left her job after 8 years, Wood was at a loss to describe the hateful episodes. She was ashamed and embarrassed. She answered that her reasons had been personal. Her claim for unemployment, you will not be surprised to find out, for unemployment benefits was denied. So what's happening according to Fricker in this case is Carmita Wood, is undergoing a horrible experience, but she can't conceptualize it, right? So she can't go to, the relevant administrators of unemployment benefit and say, look, I've been sexually harassed, that's why I left my last job. And that's because at the time when this happened, the concept of sexual harassment didn't exist in our society, right? So that was just not a conceptual resource that Carmita could access in order to interpret and describe what had happened to her. So what we gather from this case is that she was the victim of sexual harassment. We know that now, right? She did not know that she was the victim of sexual harassment, however, because she didn't have the relevant concept. And in virtue of that, she was unable to interpret and understand what her experience amounted to, right? To this lack in conceptual repertoire. Why did that happen? Well, because this particular type of aggression had not been fully conceptualized at the time. Obviously, we had the concept of sex and we had the concept of harassment. We just didn't have the concept of sexual harassment. And according to Miranda, this is plausibly because of the systematic hermeneutical marginalization of women at the time, right? Their exclusion, as Miranda well puts it, from social meaning production. So because sexual harassment was, a problem for women, and women were not part of the big conceptual factory, as it were. They were not, involved in meaning production, nor were they central to meaning production. We had this conceptual lack in our conceptual repertoire. So the result of this was that in virtue of women's not being at the forefront of the, conceptual repertoire building, Carmita Wood suffered from hermeneutical injustice. So this is all good and well, but let's try to get a bit more precise about what hermeneutical injustice is supposed to be. So how shall we, individuate this phenomenon? So Fricker never explicitly states necessary and sufficient conditions for this, so one has to dig deep into the text, but I think that she's being pretty clear, so I think that what she takes to be necessary and sufficient conditions for hermeneutical injustice are the following. The first, it needs to be the case, according to Miranda, that what we have in the relevant cases is a conceptual ignorance of the part of the speaker. So the speaker it should be the case that the speaker doesn't, possess the relevant concept. It should be the case that the reason why the speaker doesn't have the concept is because there is a lack of conceptual resources in the relevant community. So it's not that, she just doesn't go to school and that's why she doesn't have the relevant concept. It's because there is a systematic lack at the level of the community when it comes to that particular conceptual resource. And it should be, given that it's a type of injustice, this particular lack should be unjustly brought about, right? So it should, for the longest time we didn't have the concept of atom. That was not an instance of injustice. It was just, us not being particularly sophisticated. So what needs to be the case is that this lack at the level of community, at the level of the community's conceptual resources, is brought about unjustly through hermeneutical marginalization. So through what I described earlier, right? So because we don't care about this particular group of people, we don't produce concepts for phenomena that interests them, right? Now, just one caveat. Miranda is clear about the fact that this need not be systematic, right? So it need not be the case that this kind of marginalization is systematic, right? It can be just an on-off affair, but it still should be the case that this lack is brought about through hermeneutical marginalization. So here are my problems with Fricker's account. I'm going to start with 3. So recall 3, the thought was that the lack of conceptual resources is brought about unjustly through hermeneutical marginalization, right? So I want to say that that's too strong, and that's because, injustice in general needs not be brought about by marginalization of any sort. It usually is the case that is brought about by marginalization, and it mostly is the case that that's how it's brought about, right? But it can be the case that socially powerful groups also suffer from injustice on occasion, even though that's, of course, less likely. So even though it is less likely that powerful groups are going to suffer from instances of injustice, it doesn't follow that it is essential to instances of injustice that the victim be a member of a marginalized group, right? So take the following case, say that I make the claim that all men are insensitive creatures. So obviously, this kind of claim is going to bring about an instance of injustice, maybe to many of my audience members right now, which, without my audience members being necessarily members of a marginalized group, right? So I'm targeting a socially powerful group, I'm targeting men, but it is unjust for me to say all men are insensitive creatures. So 3 is too strong. I want to say that 2 is too strong too. So recall what 2 said. So the concept, what needed to be the case according to Miranda for hermeneutical injustice to be instantiated was that conceptual ignorance of the part of the speaker needed to be brought about through a lack of conceptual resources in the relevant community, right? So it should be the case that we just don't have the concepts that would help these people interpret their experiences. That's necessary in Miranda's account. I want to say that's too strong, and in order to see this, consider a variation on Miranda's case, what I call sexual harassment star. Kermita Wood Star lives in a society characterized by unfair distribution of welfare. She does not have the concept of sexual harassment because her parents could not afford to send her to college. As such, when becoming the victim of sexual harassment, Kermita Star is not able to either understand what is going on or communicate her experiences to the relevant authorities. So, by stipulation, what we have here is a society that does have the concept of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment star is happening nowadays. However, Kermita Wood is unjustly basically not acquiring this concept because she doesn't have the financial resources to go to college, which would have enabled her to acquire the concept. And since by stipulation, the fact that she doesn't have this financial resources is brought about by injustice, I want to say that the fact that she can't interpret her experience right now when she's being sexually harassed by the distinguished professor is an instance of hermeneutical injustice. She fails to be able to interpret her experiences because she doesn't have the concept of sexual harassment, and the fact that she doesn't have the concept is brought about unjustly by her social milieu, even though her social milieu itself does have the relevant concept, right? So this is a case of sexual harassment, this is a case of hermeneutical injustice that would not count as such on Miranda's view, but that I want to say is a case that we should account for in our view of hermeneutical injustice. So what is then more plausibly the case is that what needs to happen for hermeneutical epistemic injustice to be instantiated is that the relevant hermeneutic ignorance should be brought about through social injustice, right? Whether the relevant social injustice is instantiated via not even producing the concept to begin with, or whether it is instantiated via blocking the access of the victim to the concept, right? It doesn't matter. What's important is that the victim does display hermeneutic ignorance through social injustice. So that's one step in the direction of the right account, but I want to say that that's not quite right. Either recall Fricker's condition 1, what should be the case for hermeneutical injustice to be instantiated, it should be the case that we have conceptual ignorance of the part of the speakers. And I want to give you another case that suggests that even this condition is too strong. So we have sexual harassment double star. In this society, sexual harassment is properly theorized, and Wood double star herself is quite competent with the concept. She's disposed to draw proper inferences employing it. She can offer a more or less precise definition. She can give examples. And as a matter of fact, she applies the concept very reliably. However, she's not infallible. When it comes to friends, family, and respected figures, Wood double star, like most of us, tends to be epistemically vulnerable. Same as in the original sexual harassment case, the distinguished Professor P seems unable to keep his hands off her. Although generally competent with the concept of sexual harassment, Wood double star is incapable of employing it on this particular occasion because of the men's social position, right, of power. Conceptual competence does not imply infallibility in conceptualizing or any plausible account of conceptual competence in the literature. All it implies is some sort of reliability in applying the concept, right? So reliability is compatible with failure. So what's happening to Carmita in this case? Well, she does not think that Professor P is sexually harassing her. She thinks he's just flirting, right? So she thinks to herself, I will just not encourage him and he will stop, right? So what's happening here? It seems as though Carmita fails to properly interpret her experience, right? She is being sexually harassed. You know, the guy is not just flirting with her. And why is it the case that she can't interpret her experiences? Well, it's not out of conceptual ignorance. She knows what sexual harassment is. She applies the concept very reliably. It's just that what's happening in this case is she, exhibits a failure in concept application in virtue of the fact that the man is in power, right? So because of, the power structure at play in this case, she just can't believe her eyes, right? So she just can't believe that such a distinguished scientist would do such a thing. Therefore, she fails to properly interpret her experience, right? So what we get then is that conceptual ignorance is not needed for hermeneutical epistemic injustice to be instantiated, right? I mean, we have definitely a hermeneutical failure here, right? She's definitely failing to properly interpret her experience, but it's not in virtue of conceptual ignorance, it's in virtue of failure of concept application, right? And why does she fail to apply this concept? Well, in virtue of some, social injustice, right? So what's happening to her is she should not be put in a situation where someone in such a position of power is sexually harassing her. And because of this social relation, because of this power relation that's instantiated in this context, she can't believe what's happening. She can't believe that such a distinguished professor would do such a thing. So I want to say that it is a real shame if our account of hermeneutical injustice is not able to account for what's happening to Carmita with double star, especially since I want, to suggest that this kind of cases are very ubiquitous, maybe the most ubiquitous ones. So if you're on board with me on this count, it follows that what's more plausibly necessary for hermeneutical injustice to be instantiated is not ignorance on the part of the speaker, but it's a failure in concept application, right? Whether it's sourced in ignorance or not. It can be sourced in ignorance, but it need not be, right? I want to suggest that in our society, at least in this part of the world, this kind of cases are going to be more ubiquitous than cases in which the victim just doesn't have the concept of sexual harassment, right? So what kind of failure in concept application do we need for hermeneutical injustice to be instantiated? It is a failure in concept application that's sourced in some sort of social injustice, right? Because otherwise it's just hermeneutical failure, it's not hermeneutical injustice. All right, so recall Miranda's account. So we've seen that she asked for three things to be instantiated, for hermeneutical injustice to be instantiated. And I've argued, hopefully convincingly, that all of them are too strong, right? You don't need conceptual ignorance in order to be a victim of hermeneutical injustice. You can be, perfectly competent with the concept and still fail to apply it in virtue of some social factors. We don't need it to be the case that there's a lack of conceptual resources in the relevant community. The community can be, conceptually fine, but it can just block your access to the relevant concept, again, unjustly. And it need not be the case that you're a member of a marginalized group in order for this to happen to you. This can well happen to members of pretty powerful groups. So here is the question that we're left with. On Fricker's account, we knew perfectly fine what was the epistemic failure involved in hermeneutical injustice. It was ignorance, right? It was, garden variety ignorance, right? So now that seems to be off the table, one question that arises is what kind of epistemic problem do we have in cases of hermeneutical injustice if ignorance is not what's, at the core of the phenomenon? So here's my proposal, and see if you like it. So I want to say that hermeneutical injustice is, epistemically speaking, so the bad part of it, the epistemically bad part of it, is unjustly brought about epistemic basing failure. So we've seen that what's happening in cases of hermeneutical injustice is that the victim has a particular experience, call it experience of type T, right? She's warranted to believe that she's undergoing that experience, right? So think again of the last case of Carmita Double Star. She definitely was warranted to believe that she's being sexually harassed, yet she didn't, right? She fails to form the relevant belief in virtue of unjustly brought about episodic failure in concept application, right? So that's what we've seen so far. I want to say that the epistemic bad thing that's happening in these cases is a failure in basing. There's warrant out there, there's justification out there to believe that you're undergoing this particular experience, but you fail to take it up. And you fail to take up this justification and form beliefs based on it due to some sort of injustice that's inflicted on you. So let me convince you that that's true. Let's start with the cases. So let's start backwards. Let's start with sexual harassment double star. Just to remind you, this was the person who had the concept but just failed to apply it on a particular occasion because the harasser was a distinguished professor. So what my view says about this is, well, Carmita Wood, double star, has all the warrants she needs in order to base her beliefs on it, available to her, right? So, in a way, what's happening there is somehow her access to the relevant warrant is blocked by the position of power that the guy inflicting this on her has, right? So she has the concept, She has all the available conceptual resources. She knows exactly what's going on, what the guy did to her, but she fails to base her belief on his evidence that's readily available to her in virtue of this socially unjust power play. So that was the easy case. Let's move on to the more complex case. Remember sexual harassment star. What's happening in sexual harassment star, just for you to remember again, is that, the society at large does have the concept of sexual harassment. It's just poor Carmita that doesn't have it because she didn't go to college, and she didn't go to college because of some socially unjust circumstance. She couldn't afford to go to college in virtue of, distributive injustice or something like that. So what's going on in this, according to my view? Well, Carmita Wood fails to apply the concept, right? The concept is available to her in her society, and she fails to apply it in virtue of conceptual ignorance, right? Which, in turn, is unjustly brought about by social factors, right? So what was happening epistemically is, again, Carmita Wood has all the epistemic resources in that society, right? The concept is available, the instances are ubiquitous, and so on. It's just that her access to this epistemic resource is blocked unjustly via her not having enough resources to go to college. So again, it's a failure in basing in that we have ready availability when it comes to epistemic resources. All that she needs in order to come to know that she's been sexually harassed is available. The concept is readily available. Everything is available, but her access to these very readily available goods is blocked by social factors. So the complicated case is going to be the original sexual harassment case. Because in the original sexual harassment case, it seems weird for me to say that Carmita Wood has, anything readily available to her in terms of epistemic resource in order to form the relevant belief. So how is it, you might wonder, that the original case is a case of failure in basing, given that there's nothing, available to poor Carmita to base her beliefs on, because the concept is not even produced in the relevant society. So here's what I want to say about this case. And if you don't buy it now, you might buy it later, and I, make an analogy with cases from everyday distributive injustice. So I want to say that the victim in this case fails epistemically in virtue of an unjust basing failure at the level of her social group. So I want to say that this is a peculiar case of indirect hermeneutical epistemic injustice. So here's how I think about these things. This society, by stipulation, has readily available to it all resources in order to produce the relevant concept, right? So, we have the concept of sex, we have the concept of harassment, and you have ubiquitous instances of the phenomena, right, that are affecting a huge number of people, right? So it is not the case that for the relevant society is hard epistemic work to produce the concept. So that's, by stipulation, as Fricker describes the case. When she goes into detail about how the concept actually occurs, she says, well, Carmita Wood goes and complains to this other female professor, and this female professor decides to have a protest together with a bunch of other colleagues on this issue, and they realize that if they want to protest this, they need to call it somehow. They need to dub it. So they get together, and they're thinking, well, we all had this kind of experiences, but how should they call them, right? And, there are several proposals. Shall we call them sexual violence? Well, this seems a bit much. Shall we call them something else? And, in half an hour discussion, they come up with sexual harassment. So it's not like, the resources weren't there. The only thing that the Carmita Wood incident triggered was, basic, right? So we had all the epistemic resources, and finally someone gathered them. Someone took interest in taking all these epistemic resources that were lying around, gathering them, and forming the relevant belief, right? So what I want to say is that if you are on board with me about what I said in the case in which we have the concept in society and Karmita fails to access it due to her access being blocked, then you need to be on board with what I say now, which is that the society at large exhibits the exact same failure, right? So in the original case, so what's happening here is Karmita doesn't have readily available resources, but her society does, right? The society, the social milieu that she lives in, could have easily accessed these epistemic resources, but they don't, right? And in virtue of the fact that they don't, she doesn't have access to the resource, right? So what's happening here is her failure in basing is an indirect failure in virtue of the failure in basing that her social milieu exhibits. And here is an analogy such that you see why this is a plausible interpretation of the case. Consider a case in which a state can easily produce a drug to treat a particular disease, right? So let's call drug X and disease Y. Say that this is a terrible disease, but the thing is that it only affects this very small group of marginalized people that this particular society just happens to not care about that much, right? And because they don't care about that much, they fail to produce drug X. Otherwise, they have all the resources. Say that X is just produced from drug P and drug Q, right? All they need is to combine P and Q. It's extremely cheap. Everything's available to them, and they just fail to do that because they don't care about this particular group of people. So I want to say that that's exactly what's happening in Karmita Wood's original scenario. And if you're on board with me that that's what's happening, then you're going to have to be on board with me that this is an indirect failure in basing, in that in virtue of the failure in basing at societal level, Karmita also fails to interpret her experiences. So this is all good and well, but why should we? So it's important to have a more precise account of hermeneutical epistemic injustice for many reasons. We don't want to, leave out cases that are plausibly cases of hermeneutical epistemic injustice, especially given, the ethical kind of implications of this. But I want to say that there's something more important for theorizing that comes out of this discussion. How much time do I have left?
10 minutes?
10 minutes. I can go on.
20 minutes. Sorry, 20 minutes.
20? Oh,
yes.
Going to be very early. So why is it that I think that this is an important point to make? Well, Miranda Fricker is very keen in the beginning of her book to point out that epistemic injustice is, an epistemic phenomenon, a sui generis epistemic phenomenon, right? So she begins by saying, well, look, epistemic goods are like all others, obviously. We can distribute them justly or unjustly. For instance, some people can't go to school in some unjust societies, and that's not nice. That's, unjust distribution of goods. But that, she says, is not what I'm interested in, right? So that kind of injustice of distributive nature that we can find when it comes to epistemic goods, just as well as we can find when it comes to, potatoes, is not the kind of injustice that I'm interested in. I'm interested in, two particular sui generis types of injustice of epistemic sort, right? So she wants to say that when it comes to testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice, we can't theorize about these issues based on, just good old distributive justice theory, right? We need epistemologists for this. Because these cases are just not easily reducible to problem cases for distributive justice, right? And, I hate to say this, but I think she's wrong. We don't need epistemologists for this. We need them for other things. So here is why I think she's wrong. What would this sui generis claim imply? So think about distributive injustice a bit, right? So we've been theorizing in distributive injustice for a while now, 2,000 years or so. So, if between utilitarians who would say, well, let's distribute education as in a way in which we maximize, well-being in society, in which case we'll probably end up only sending geniuses to school or something like that. And then you would have your good old Kantians who would suggest, no, all people should be treated as ends in themselves, so maybe then we should, give good education to everybody, or your good old egalitarian who would roughly probably end up with the same result as Kant on this particular occasion. So it would be, pretty easy to theorize about these issues if we could reduce epistemic injustice to mere distributive injustice. But that's exactly what Miranda wants to say is not possible when it comes to testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. So the reason why I didn't talk about testimonial injustice is because Jennifer Lackey already has. So Jennifer Lackey convincingly, according to me, argues in a paper that testimonial injustice is garden variety distributive injustice. So she very roughly gives cases in which, you do assign the deserved credibility to women, right? They deserve credibility 0.7 and you assign credibility 0.7. That's perfectly fine. However, compatibly with that, you assign credibility to men, right? So say that you're a teacher in a class, you assign the deserved credibility to women, 0.7, and you assign 0.9 to all men, just because, they're men. Jennifer says, well, this seems to be a case of testimonial injustice, but you're not fulfilling Miranda's condition. You are not assigning less credibility than deserved to your member of the marginalized group. So this, Jennifer Lackey thinks, is a reason to believe that actually testimonial injustice is just garden variety distributive injustice. It's not only about how much I give, to J, it is also about how much I give to you, to all of you, given how much I give to J, right? So that's Jennifer Lackey's view about testimonial injustice. So if she's right, obviously, discussions of testimonial injustice are going to become garden variety discussions of distributive injustice. So we're going to be, able to properly theorize about this phenomenon without finding it mysterious and, sui generis epistemic by just applying our good old theories of distribution in the relevant literature, which would be nice because those people have been thinking about this for 2,000 years in a way in which we haven't about testimonial injustice. So I'm all in favor of that. So I want to say the same thing about hermeneutical injustice. So I want to say that if I'm right, and hermeneutical injustice is an instance of basing failure, it is but an instance of good old distributive injustice, right? So in order to see that, consider what I've just said, that in cases of hermeneutical injustice, the victim's access to relevant conceptual goods is unjustly blocked, right? So I said, well, look, what's happening in these cases is we have the epistemic resources out there and we fail to base on them for some reason or another that is sourced in some sort of social injustice. So in order to see that that's something that can be easily theorized with garden variety distributive injustice tools, note the analogy between this case and people that are unjustly prevented from accessing extant resources, right? Such as food and shelter and education and health and so on, right? So, in what's happening in most cases of hermeneutical injustice is pretty similar to what's happening to people who can't access potatoes, right? The available epistemic resources are, they're out there just like potatoes, but I can't access them, right? So if that's the case, it's going to follow the Fricker's sui generis claim is false for hermeneutical injustice, right? We can very nicely theorize about these issues. Now, why do I think that that's important? Well, because that it's going to make it easier to actually, maybe have a bit of impact on society. So here's the thing. If we think that hermeneutical injustice is this mysterious epistemic phenomenon that nobody else other than epistemologists know anything about, it's going to be very hard to try to fix policy in order to avoid it, right? It's going to be very, very hard to go from epistemological theorizing about what's bad and what's good epistemologically to, political science. It's a huge, long way between the two, right? Because you're going to have to first explain why it's epistemically wrong, then make an argument that in virtue of being epistemically wrong is also ethically wrong, and then make an argument that, given that it's ethically wrong, maybe we should change policy. However, if it's a garden variety distributive injustice, that's pretty good news, right? Because then we can, we have specialists that design policy in order to, ideally distribute potatoes justly. And whatever is going to be said about just distribution of potatoes, we can then say about just distribution of conceptual goods, right? So that's going to be, if that's the case, if Jennifer Leck and myself are right, that epistemic injustice, at least these two instances that Miranda identifies, are merely garden variety distributive injustice, then it's going to be very easy for us, for policy, to try to fix these instances. So I hope I'm right. Thanks.